This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
A United Nations report on urbanization states that more than 50% of the global population now live in urban areas. But the figure is projected to increase to 75% by 2050 at a growing rate of 65 million urban dwellers annually. The United Nations has designated October 31st as the World Cities Day with an aim to addressing the challenges of urbanization while contributing to sustainable urban development around the world. This week, we look at some of the challenges of growing urban populations in Africa and ask whether technological innovations can help address some of these issues. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, in many countries around the world, administrative capitals are in a different city from financial centers in a bid to ease congestion. Nigeria is one of the few African countries that have done this, relocating their federal capital from Lagos to Abuja in 1991. To mark the World Cities Day, our correspondent Kelechi Emekalam looks at Abuja today and how it is dealing with the challenges of a growing urban population. Take a look.
Nigeria's federal capital city, located in the central region. As the country's administrative capital, it's an attraction to many in search of greener pastures. Abuja is home to about 5 billion people and still counting, though the UN suggests it could be as much as 7 million. The growing population is a major concern to town planners here.
This congestion will now create a lot of problems. Problems in the sense that issues of housing, sanitation, transportation, and what have you. They are the major factors that causes the city to become not viable for any physical development.
Abuja city grew by about 140% between 2000 and 2010. That's according to the UN. With an annual growth of at least 35% since 2015, it remains one of Africa's fastest growing cities. The city is adorned with some of the most stunning edifices in the country. But it's a different ball game on the outskirts. Many who live and work here come from outside the city center, and most of the communities there lack basic amenities and social infrastructure.
We are actually looking at a system of upgrading so that the city suburban area can also, the government can intervene and provide social amenities there so that it will complement with what is in the city center.
Countries like China have been partnering with government to tackle some of the infrastructural challenges. For instance, the rail and airport projects are partnerships that have thrived and contributed to urbanization here. And many are calling for inclusivity to extend developmental projects beyond the nation's capital. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
The story of Abuja there, like many other African cities, a growing population. Well, join me now to unpack World Cities Day and the future of Africa's urbanization from Johannesburg, Sithole Mbanga. He's the Chief Executive Officer of South African Cities Network. In Lagos, Dr. Oseme Oigiagbe, an expert on urbanization and innovation. And in Nairobi, with me here, Professor Alfred Omenya, the CEO of EcoBuild Africa. Gentlemen, welcome to the program today. Well, it is World Cities Day. First off, to you all, is there anything to celebrate, particularly for African countries that have a growing population? Professor Omenya.
Well, I think the issue in Africa is that we are working after the fact. So yes, there's quite some progress in African countries and African cities. We see, for example, Johannesburg, we had Gautrain running there, we have the BRT. You see, for example, in Dar es Salaam, we have the rapid bus transport being put in place. You see in Kenya, for example, the conversations around light rail network and public transport and so on. I myself did quite a bit of work on Eco-Atlantic that the Nigerians are proposing to decongest Lagos and so on. But Africa is actually caught up in a catch-22 situation, in the sense that we are actually trying to create order out of a mess. We are not creating cities from first principles, despite the opportunity to do it. Exactly. So what happens is that we have all these problems in the city, and then we try to retrofit the city to be able to respond to some of these issues, and that's a big challenge.
Sithole and Mbanga, South African cities are some of the better planned cities on the continent. As we celebrate this World Cities Day, though, briefly from your perspective, is there anything to celebrate here?
So any growth needs to be celebrated. That being said, and I think in support of what my colleagues are saying, we need to be wary of the type of growth that we are celebrating. I think we are celebrating unsustainable growth because, as you also correctly point out, our growth is not supported by the correct fundamentals, the fundamentals of planning. But I do think that there's something much more deeper about our understanding of growth. Suppose growth is defined as urbanization, which is the growth of the population in the African cities. We need to understand that, unlike in Europe, for instance, our growth or our urbanization is not as a consequence of economic growth. Right. It is actually driven by poverty. It is driven by the type of poverty that you see in your non-urbanized areas, in your non-built-up areas. And therefore, we need to start defining our growth differently to the global term of urbanization or growth in the urban areas. And I think it's quite fundamental, therefore, to how we will find African solutions to the type of growth or urbanization that we are experiencing. Ours is different in that way.
Dr. Oseme, let's get your thoughts on this, because Lagos in Nigeria is one of the fastest and the biggest growth cities in the world.
There is a lot to celebrate, and I think other than promoting the interest of a global community, the interest of also looking at the cooperation of the opportunities and challenges that sustainable urbanization will bring to our environment. The growth potentials in Lagos and as a city is quite enormous, and the population in terms of square kilometer and square mile is showing that there is urbanization, the rapid urbanization is growing, which is looking at the drivers, the economic drivers, that is bringing the urbanization of a city to the level you are seeing. I do understand from my colleagues who have mentioned issue about South Africa and Nairobi, the Lagos issue has a different perspective, and the perspective is certainly driven by economic, the demographic shift that is creating the city is driven by economic growth.
Professor Omenya, let me come here back to you, because we do understand that by 2050, 60% of African populations will be living in cities. Your thoughts are that rural-urban migration is driving the Kenyan scenario. Lagos is being driven by economic prospects. First of all, paint for us a picture here about what is driving growth in your city, for instance, in Nairobi.
One of the issues that we need to look at is that Africa's urbanization is very different from Western urbanization. Western urbanization was basically driven by specialization, where the rural areas were basically for agricultural production, and big companies then took huge swathes of rural land and were producing there. Then the urban areas focused mainly on non-agriculture, so issues around services, issues around companies, and so on. So the sort of growth that we saw in the West was wealth creation that was basically based on non-agricultural processes. But what we have in Africa is that we have a situation where we have fragmentation of rural land, and we have lack of rural productivity. So we have collapse of agricultural systems in rural areas. And people then move to these conurbations of settlements that then we call urban. Be they small rural trading centers, be they secondary towns and so on. And the people are going there not to drive an economic model of production. People are going there because they have no choice. They have no land in rural areas, they have no work in rural areas, and the poor. The urbanization of poverty is a very, very important thing that we have to look at in the African cities.
Right. Let me get the thoughts of Sithole Mbanga here, because the agglomeration of the cities around Johannesburg, the population is expected to be about 8 million now. When you listen to what Professor Omenya is talking about there, that perhaps much of it is being driven by poverty, is that the scenario in cities in South Africa?
There are two things that have happened in South Africa, at least for the last 20 years, or let me say since democracy. One, the walls of apartheid fell. So that meant that people that were trapped, and predominantly black African people that were trapped in rural areas, now had the opportunity to move out of the entrapments of poverty, both physical poverty, education poverty, health facility poverty, transportation poverty. And then they looked into your bigger cities, Johannesburg, Durban, Cape Town, Bloemfontein, Mangaung, and the likes. So that was the first movement of inward migration from rural into the urban areas. But secondly, there was a movement from outside of South Africa. So as the apartheid walls fell, you also had a huge influx of people from the neighboring countries of South Africa. And the Constitution of South Africa is quite liberal in terms of accepting human beings first and foremost. So you then had an upsurge, but it was not driven by economic growth. And I still want to repeat that. And so I agree with the professor in Nairobi when he speaks about the urbanization of poverty. So poverty moved from rural areas into urban areas, hence the notion of the urbanization of poverty.
Dr. Oseme, listening to the different scenarios coming out of the discussion here, do you feel, though, that urbanization in Africa at the moment is definitely inevitable?
It's inevitable because the world is dynamic and growth is an issue that we must take consideration. The rural area, he also mentioned that the rural area, the agricultural, which used to be the economic stay, is no longer attractive to the people staying in the rural area. So there is a shift from the rural area to the urban centers where there is some form of employability of the new methods of production, which is a factory or industry. And there's also a mix, a disconnect. African countries, or like Lagos or any other countries, most of the means of production or technical means of production that has high employability level are set up in the urban areas. And so, therefore, there's that mix between the issue of urbanization, mix of production, and employability, and which is reflecting to the drift. The issue about urbanization will continue to haunt us as Africa, as Africans, and especially in countries that has land mass. And I said carefully, the whole of Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, where the growth projection has been put that in the next 25 years, there will be over 25% growth in population in the urban centers.
Right, on that thought, we're going to take a short break now. And when we come back, we'll have more on the future of urbanization in Africa. Don't go away.
Life moves pretty fast. Ideas move at the speed of sound. Technology moves at the speed of light. If you don't filter out the noise, you might miss the details. We pay attention to the details because they matter, showing you a different perspective. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, still with me, Sithole Mbanga in Johannesburg, Dr. Oseme Oigiagbe in Lagos, and Professor Alfred Omenya. Now, before the break, we looked at the challenges of growing urban populations across Africa. Let's now look at whether technological innovation can help in providing solutions. Sithole Mbanga, what is the most innovative approach, though, that you've come across that African urban centers are dealing with their challenges? Can you give some specifics of innovations that have worked in some cities?
I've noticed that communication, in other words, how city governments are communicating with their customers, be they households or the entrepreneurial citizen, in other words, the business person, that has improved a lot. And the assumption here is that the content of that communication also is improving in one way or the other. It has led to a lot of efficiency between city governments and their respective entrepreneurs. And that's something to be celebrated because it contributes in a way, however small, to good governance. It begins to push the envelope of transparency on the part of those that play the role of city governments. And of course, I mean, other improvements have been very much about construction, planning, you know, and all of that. So there's been a lot of innovation, albeit I don't know all of it, but it's there, and you can see, at least for me, as far as I know, as far as communication between city governments and their population.
Professor Omenya.
We are seeing possibilities of African countries leapfrogging the West on a whole lot of issues because of advancement of technology. And I'm a big proponent of the 4 issues in urban areas, and I just want to highlight what technology and innovation does around this. To start with, on the economic aspects of urban development, we've seen Internet of Things. In Kenya, we have M-Pesa, we have all this. And we are seeing faster communications, we are seeing faster sharing of opportunities and so on. We are seeing a lot of people using the internet to be able to do their wares. We are seeing the urban areas being used totally differently. So you no longer need to go to the mall because the mall can come to your house and deliver the food and do all these sort of things. So from an economic point of view, there's quite a bit that is being leveraged using technology. Then from the social aspect of the city was not really supporting the way the African actually lived.
All right.
But what's happening again is that, again, through technology, we are finding that communities are meeting, communities are having conversations, communities are discussing things around the city, both online and offline. And I think this is very, very significant. Then when it comes to issues of environment, the physical aspects of the city, again, we're seeing great opportunities.
Right.
Where we're saying, look here, now we can be able to monitor our emissions. We have technologies that will enable us, figure out whether there's a new pothole around the city or not. That will enable us figure out whether a water pipe is burst in some place or not. And these are opportunities to push efficiency. Ironically, we have bigger opportunities in Africa to leverage on ICT and Internet of Things, even compared to the West.
So I want to go back to Sithole because your thought on that and innovation is that African countries should not emulate, African countries' challenges are quite different from the challenges of Western cities, and that Africa should come up with its own innovation. In your thoughts, though, how should Africa prepare for the era of mega cities that is coming up?
My sense is that we need to be definitive about the type of urbanization we want to embrace as Africa. Let me give you an example. It's very easy, I think, and I suspect it's because of our conditions, it's very easy to come across an African who says to you, oh, I wish my city was like New York. You know, there's something wrong with that statement, or any of the Singapore or whatever. There are problems in those cities as well. So we mustn't look at the current form and shape of cities that we aspire to and assume that there are no problems. So it's quite important for us to understand the opportunities, but also and the challenges of the current form in such a manner that we avoid those. And I think that's what I mean. I mean, we don't have to have skyscrapers. I mean, if that's something that someone in the African continent aspires to, because that goes with the amount of energy, by way of example, that you have to utilize going from the ground floor up to the highest floor of that particular building. So if you have to say, and this is a very a small example that I'm utilizing. I mean, we don't have to aspire to be having cars, for instance, because we know cars are great emitters of carbon, and therefore they contribute to the deterioration of the strength of the layer, the carbon layer, and the likes and the likes. So we have to define our own type of urbanism.
So in defining, yes, go ahead, Professor Omenya.
Sithole, I just want to add there that you know, this why I'm actually convinced that the real game changer in Africa is to do urbanization around people. Because, for example, if you, the highways you're talking about and the skyscrapers you're talking about is urbanization around things. But if you look at people and ask yourselves, how do people actually want to be in the city? You want to walk away with your children. You want young people to play games and sports in the city. You want people to live in a healthy way and so on. And if we did urbanization around people, then in a way, what you're saying, which I used to call the inferiority complex of Africa's urbanization, where African city would say, when I grow up, I want to be like New York. And I was saying, what's wrong with the counter statement? That when I grow up, I want to be a good city where everybody can actually enact and realize, the beauty of their lives.
Right.
So I'm supporting that.
Sithole, your response to that?
Can I just add, Beatrice, if I may, and so that it's not like it's not like I'm attacking non-African countries. I mean, if you look at a city like Johannesburg,
right,
it was designed for a car.
Correct.
So the bulk of the space is used for vehicle movement, and in those vehicles there's a single or two passengers. So most people are poor. As long as you don't have a car, you can't own the city. So only those people that have access to a vehicle, and that's because the design of the city then emulated your non-African city. It was not designed, I think as the professor is saying, for a person. It was designed for a car. Those examples we need to disabuse ourselves from.
Right. Dr. Oseme, though, in defining Africa's type of urbanization, let's draw from the experience of Lagos, because Lagos has gone from 763,000 people in the 60s to today's 21 million. How do you make a city like that, though, livable?
I want to bring back to the initial discussion that if you have a smart city, or you aim at some form of smart city where you leave less pressure in terms of movement, there probably will be, the urbanization reality will be easily solved. But back to your question, the context is that the science of natural resources, which in development of natural resources, as what has become an issue. The natural resources are laid back in the rural area. And so, but there are no means of development for those natural resources. And once there are no the natural resources are not developed, people will certainly move. The quest for movement to Lagos has been a phenomenon. Because if you look at the current size of Lagos in terms of square kilometers and the landmass, the population per square kilometer is hovering over 3 million. And if you look at it, it's not healthy for the city. And there's right now there's probably nowhere to grow to. I listened to the issue of high rises from Johannesburg or from looking at New York. That is inevitable for cities like Lagos, because when people migrate to cities, they have to live in houses. They cannot live on the road, and you cannot put them in layers of themselves.
All right, gentlemen, very interesting conversation, but I do want to get a very brief comment from you all as we wind up. Dr. Oseme, let me start off with you, though, because it is obvious that there are challenges of urbanization, but urbanization is inevitable in Africa. If you are asked to name one of the most serious or the most serious issue that needed to be solved now, which one would that be in order to make African cities better livable?
I think it has to do with our investment in infrastructure in terms of system design, planning, execution, and capacity, and our ability to manage the variability of our environment in line with the culture of our persons. I do understand we have a cultural issue, so but those investments in infrastructure, because that's where you have the most pressure, and that infrastructure to go in line with our people, our persons. We are not a flying environment, but we're definitely a land mass moving people. Not our waterways are not that intermodal, are not that within the countrysides. They are all on the coastal level. So there is a need for one important thing is to look at how do we do the infrastructure design, process, planning, execution, and the variability that comes with the environment, climate change, and other things that could come into our environment, so that we can have a more livable city, a city that will be easily accessible, that can accommodate the pressure. Just as we said, we cannot define and you cannot restrict the person's, the number of, we don't have policies that will restrict the number of children you can have or number of persons per family. So therefore, so it is important that we manage that situation with the current position that the current limited resources that Africa has. Because once we manage the infrastructure very well, the other part of it will fall in place. And you can have a better city.
Very briefly, thank you. Sithole Mbanga, very briefly, if you may.
Well, I mean, my parting shot will be, I think we need to change our mindset. We need to understand that human beings are anthropological beings. In other words, we are meant to move. We are meant to evolve. We are meant to live here today and to live there tomorrow, depending on what do we see as a place of opportunity. If we can just do that, then we would, I think, almost automatically move everything else to respond to the human being. So in other words, let's design cities for people. Let's not design cities for cars. Let's not design cities because we want a building that looks like ABC. Let's design for the functionality of a human being.
Professor Omenya, very briefly, the one thing that needs to be solved.
Thank you. I think building up on Sithole's statement, what I would really like to see in Africa is really what I call just city. I want to see a lot more of a democratic city. I want to see a city where people take part in the governance. I want to see a city where where the city enables people to realize the fullest potential, socially, economically, and otherwise. I want to see a city of citizens, people who belong to the city and they know it's their home, whichever way we actually define it. I want to see a city where children can walk. I want to see a city where a disabled person can come from their place of stay and go to their place of work and realize the fullest potential. I want to see a city that is inclusive. And like I was saying, I was building on Sithole's point, I want to see a city for people, first and foremost. The rest should actually support that.
All right, gentlemen, very interesting discussion there on Africa's cities. But that's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa. A big thank you to all my guests, Sithole Mbanga, Chief Executive Officer of South African Cities Network, joining us from Johannesburg, Dr. Oseme Oigiagbe, an expert on urbanization and innovation, joining me from Lagos, and Professor Alfred Omenya, CEO of EcoBuild Africa, joining me here in studio. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter, and you can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. To keep the conversation going, and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, thank you and goodbye.